And I love reading your reporting because you are the straightest shooter and you don't mince words here. You write this. Fiddling with figures like net operating income is a big deal. Can you explain just how big of a deal that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're a lender and you have a loan against a property, your principal concern is this property going to throw off enough income so that then the person who borrowed money from me can pay back the money that they owe? And that there's a ratio there. What's the profits to what's the amount of money that they have to pay back? That ratio is called the debt service coverage ratio. It's a long technical term for basically is this person going to have the dough to pay me back? And banks look at what that ratio is very carefully. Now, if your income drops significantly or is significantly lower than what your lender believes it is, then that throws off that ratio. And that ratio is one of the key financial components and covenants that the borrower has to keep when borrowing money. So if the ratio drops below a certain level, then that triggers an event of default. In this case, if you look at the numbers that Deutsche Bank believed Trump was earning at Trump National Doral, the golf resort in Miami, that was plenty of money to cover the debt service coverage ratio. However, if you look at the same figures, the net operating income that were filed on local tax appeals, that number would then drop the debt service coverage ratio below the threshold that it had to hit as part of the financial covenants associated with this loan. And that would trigger an event of default for Donald Trump, according to these documents. So you have a big deal here where, yeah, it's a small number and it sounds like, a couple $1,000,000, this is a billionaire. But wait a second, if you change those numbers, all of a sudden it could spark an event of default with Donald Trump's primary lender, Deutsche Bank. That could have ripple effects in the rest of his business. So little number, big deal overall.
And is there any evidence that directly links former President Donald Trump to these numbers not adding up?
Well, they're his properties, of course. And Donald Trump for years has said public numbers that are not true in terms of what his properties are worth, in terms of how much money they're throwing off, in terms of what their size is, that sort of thing. Now, Donald Trump also was required to sign documents over the years affirming that certain financial information that he was submitting to his banks was accurate. However, the numbers that we're looking at most closely here are when Donald Trump was president. Now, when he was president, he put his assets in a trust. He still owned it all. It was just basically a shell entity. And Alan Weisselberg, his former chief financial officer, and Donald Trump Jr., his son, were the two trustees of that trust. We don't have paperwork showing that Donald Trump in 2017 and 18 was signing off on the documents that showed different numbers in one place and different numbers in another. Yes, they're his assets. It's all his money. He still all owned it, but we just haven't seen that paperwork yet. It would make sense if instead either Alan Weisselberg or Don Jr. were signing off on that paperwork because they were the trustees of the trust at that time.
In your reporting for Forbes, the title is Bad Accounting or Fraud. So let's say this is fraud. What happens to Donald Trump if it is figured out that these numbers here, because they didn't add up, they were purposefully fudged?
Yeah, well, we'll see. Obviously, he's facing a massive fraud case right now, one over the valuation of his assets. This would seem to be something a little bit different, misleading a bank, not just about what the values are, but about what the underlying operating income and profitability is of a particular asset. But there's a lot of steps between now and where he would actually face consequences. So first of all, you would have to have an investigator say, okay, this is concerning enough that we're going to open up an investigation. Then you would have them open up an investigation. They would have to ask the Trump organization. The Trump organization would theoretically have to give more complete and more explicable explanations than they gave me that actually made these numbers add up. If they didn't, then they would look further. Perhaps they would launch a lawsuit. Then you'd have a lawsuit. Then you'd have a judgment. So we're a long, long way from him seeing any consequences from this sort of thing. But nonetheless, it shows a consistent pattern of behavior where throughout his business, you see numbers in one place and numbers in a different place that just don't quite line up.